Right, so now that we've completed the design for our app, we're finally ready to actually give our app some functionality. And the first thing we have to do is we have to detect when a user actually clicks on one of the images. And the way that we're going to do that is by using a button. If you head over to the widget catalog and go into the material components, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of buttons that we can choose from, such as a raised button, which has a little bit of a shadow around it, the floating action button, which we've already seen before, and a flat button, which reacts to touches by filling with color. And there's icon buttons, so a button that just has an icon in it, drop down, pop-up menu, a whole bunch of other things that you could use. The one that we're going to pick is a flat button. And I'm going to put that flat button around our first dice image and change the tree to look like this. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to select the widget that we want to wrap our flat button around, which is going to be our image, the first one here of 2. And then I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and hit Enter. And now I get to wrap it with a new widget. And it's going to be a flat button in this case. Now remember that we always want to get the Dart formatter to help us. And we need to add a comma after every widget so that when we hit save, it'll reformat it correctly for us. And this way our code looks neat and tidy, and we can see easily at a glance that the image is a child of the flat button. Now, the thing that you notice here straight away is that the left image has suddenly become smaller. Well, why is that? Well, probably it's gotten a little bit more padding added to it that came along with the flat button. Now, how can we find out for sure? Well, when your app is running and you click on the refresh button, then our flat button shows up. And if we click on the flat button, then down here will pop up all of the properties that are currently set for that button. And you can see that it's a really long list and includes things such as the text color or the color of the button. But at the moment, all of these are null because it's actually just a see-through component, which you can see here, but the user can't see because it doesn't have any color, it doesn't have any background, it doesn't have any text. It only has a single child, which is our image here. If we click inside anywhere inside this area with the properties and you start typing for padding, and if you hit the down button, you'll go through all the places where there's padding applied to this widget. Then you can see that the button actually by default comes with 16 pixels of padding. So there's padding that's applied to the left and the right, which is why the image that's inside our flat button is actually even smaller than the one that isn't inside a flat button. To fix this and get it back to the appearance that we had before, all we need to do is just to remove the padding that we applied and use the one that came from the button. So let's hit save, and you can see all we have now is the padding that's from our button. And if I refresh that, then my padding disappears. All I'm left with is my button. And let's click somewhere around here and start typing padding. And if I go down a bit, you can see all we have now is the padding that came with the button, which is 16 from the left and 16 from the right. And if I just enable the debug paint, then you can see that my button is this box right here, and it's got 16 pixels from the left and 16 pixels from the right. And this particular notation has 4 values going from left to top to right to bottom, kind of in a circle, if you will. And again, this is very similar to what happens on the web. In Chrome, we have something called Chrome Developer Tools, which allows us to right-click on pretty much anything we see on screen, click Inspect, and we can see all of its properties right here, such as the color of the element, or the font family, or things like what size it is, how much padding, how much margin, how much border it has. So this is very, very similar. So sometimes when you're confused why something looks a certain way, it might help to dig into these properties inside the Flutter inspector. But right now I'm going to pop it away, and I'm going to go ahead and remove the padding from my second button and also embed this image inside a flat button. Now you can play around with which button you decide to choose. So the other popular one is the raised button. And if you just hit save, you'll notice that it comes with a color, it comes with some shadow, but it's actually not really what we want it to look like. All we want is just the image to appear as the button itself. So in this case, a flat button works perfectly. Now that we've seen how the flat button looks, it's time to actually make it do something. And if you notice right here in the margin on the right, we have these little yellow lines. And Android Studio does this whenever it tries to warn you that something might be wrong with your code. So we'll see this inside Dart analysis as well. And remember that when this icon is yellow, it's a warning, which means that the code will actually run and it'll try to build it. But when it's red, then it's a lot more angry about what you did, and it'll try to prevent you from crashing your app because it's detected something that will definitely fail. In this case, what it's telling us is something about a parameter called onPressed is required, both on line 25 and on line 30. Now, if you have a whole bunch of warnings and errors in here, double-clicking on it to get your cursor to move to it is a really quick and easy way of figuring out what problems you have. So what it's telling us is that flat button has a property called onPressed. And this hasn't been defined yet, because if you're going to use a button, you probably should tell the button what it's going to do when it gets pressed, right? And by us not telling it what it should do, it's a bit like hiring a new worker and just getting them to sit in the corner and not really know what work they have to do. It's very confusing for the button. So if we have a look at our documentation for flat button, it says here that it has a property called onPressed, and this is a required property. This is the reason why we're getting those errors in Dart analysis at the moment, because we haven't specified something that is required by the button. So it means that whenever you're going to use a flat button widget, you better tell it what it should do when it gets pressed. Now, if you scroll down the list of properties, you'll find our onPressed property. And it says here in the documentation that this expects something called a void callback when the button is tapped or otherwise activated. So basically, when you press the button, what it should do. And if we click on this void callback, it tells you that this is something that have no arguments and return no data. So the way that we would write this is simply a set of parentheses which are empty, and it's empty because there are no arguments or no inputs going into this void callback. And then we have a set of parentheses which is going to contain what should happen when this flat button is pressed. So this together is a void callback. And if you come from other programming languages, you might know this as an anonymous function. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to dig into this in a lot more detail if you're unfamiliar with functions and arguments and inputs and outputs. But for now, all you need to understand is that inside this set of curly braces is what will happen when the flat button gets pressed. So here we can write some code. So for example, let me write a simple print statement. So this is a function that will print whatever I put inside the parentheses. And inside the parentheses are the inputs that I'm going to give to this function to tell it what it should print. So in this case, I'm going to say left button got pressed. And then we'll close off the function with a semicolon. And now if I hit save, and when I press on this button right here, what we expect to happen is the flat button that I'm pressing on will detect a touch event, and it will trigger this part on pressed. And once that happens, it's going to look inside these curly braces to see what it should do. And in this case, we're telling it to print this piece of text into the console. So let's open up the console and let's see what happens when I click on this button. And you can see we get a message from Flutter, which is our app over here, and it says that left button got pressed, exactly what we told it to print. So print statements are commonly used across different programming languages, and it helps you to diagnose when something goes wrong. So for example, if we didn't link this up properly and it wasn't actually triggering our on pressed, well then our print statement wouldn't be shown down here, so we know there's something wrong with our flat button. Now it's your turn. Try and do the same so that when I click on the right button here, that I can get a message printed down here saying that the right button got pressed. So pause the video and try and complete that challenge. Okay, well this should be pretty simple. We've got our flat button already added to our image. So there already is a button there, but it's missing the on pressed parameter. So let's add that. Let's add our on pressed, and let's add our void callback, which if you remember consists of an empty set of parentheses and a set of curly braces. And it's inside the curly braces where we specify what should happen when that button got pressed. And in this case, we simply want to print the words right button got pressed. And we're going to end the function call with a semicolon. And now if I hit save and hot reload my app, now if I click on the right side, I get right button got pressed printed. If I click on the left side, I get left button got pressed. So in this lesson, we've created a flat button widget and we've specified what should happen when it gets pressed. And we've seen that we can use print statements to print text that we write into the console so that we as the developer know what's going on. But the user doesn't, right? All the user sees is what's on screen here. And they're seeing that when I click on it, there's this sort of animation that makes it look like something's happening, but actually nothing's happening. So the app must be broken. Well, we know that it's actually working perfectly fine, but we just need to be able to update the images when the user clicks on the buttons so that the appearance of the app updates when the user interacts with it. Now, we're going to cover that and more in the coming lessons. So once you're ready, I'll see you on the next lesson.